Southern Fried True Crime covers cases that are not suitable for young listeners, and there may also be some explicit language used. Listener discretion is advised. Typically, divorce is war. Two people who once loved each other become engaged in battle, and they play dirty. I probably shouldn't paint all divorces that way. The media would have you believe in the sensitive, conscious uncoupling that can be achieved when both parties want the same things, especially in terms of parenting their children. Unfortunately, from my experience with divorce, from my own to friends and family, I've never seen the fairy tale friendly divorces you read about with celebrities. In fact, custody issues usually exacerbate an already painful situation. In today's episode, we don't really know why Vickie and Stephen Beckham had started divorce proceedings. Vickie was a senator's daughter, and Stephen was the son of an Episcopalian bishop. This wasn't a celebrity divorce, though, not until Vickie was found brutally murdered. She was silenced forever, though her murder and divorce were now front-page news. Rumors started circulating, and of course, her would-be ex-husband eventually gave his side of the story to the press. But Vickie wasn't there to deny or confirm the rumors. She couldn't explain why she wanted out of the marriage, or how dark her separation and divorce had gotten. She had to wait for justice, for the truth to come out. Welcome to episode 122, The Bishop's Son and the Senator's Daughter, the murder of Vickie Lander Beckham. Newberry, South Carolina is known as the City of Friendly Folks. Located in the Midlands of South Carolina, Newberry lies just outside of the state's capital in Columbia and advertises its small-town charm and historical treasures. Part of these historical treasures are the pieces of well-preserved history within the town and the larger area of Newberry County. According to historian Thomas H. Polk, Newberry got its start in 1749 when Germans settled in the lower part of the present-day county, and English and Scotch-Irish settlers took up land elsewhere throughout the area, though the origin of the area's name is unknown. Before these settlers, nomadic Shawnee Native Americans lived on the Saluda River in the area in the 17th century. In the following decades, the area suffered as the result of the Cherokee War, the Regulator Movement, and then finally the Revolutionary War. Following these decades of battles and war, in 1785, Newberry became a county, with the town of Newberry serving as the county seat. By the 1790s, the population in the area had reached almost 10,000, including 1,500 enslaved Africans who were forced to work on the plantation fields. Besides farmers, tradesmen began to establish self-sufficient family units within the area, and the town of Newberry began to grow. Throughout the 19th century, Newberry County remained largely rural and home to many plantations and farms, but slowly larger settlements began to develop into villages and communities. After the Civil War, newly freed enslaved people and some poor whites were relegated to sharecropping. During Reconstruction, the introduction of cotton mills helped the economy, becoming the area's largest employer. During World War II and into the 20th century, textile plants and agriculture still widely supported the area's economy and families until a dramatic shift in the population. By the 1930s, African Americans in the area were flocking to other cities with better opportunities. The population levels in Newberry and the greater area did not recover until the 1980s. Since the 1990s, the area of Newberry has made an effort to preserve the historical significance of many spots in the county and town, and has become known as one of the most charming places in America to settle down and raise a family. It's considered a safe town and a great place to put down roots. But a violent crime from the early 90s showed that even picture-perfect small towns like Newberry have a dark underbelly. On June 12, 1994, at around 9:45 p.m., a sheriff's deputy and state trooper responded to a report of a four-door sedan found in a ditch on a deserted stretch of Little Mountain Road in Newberry County, South Carolina. It wasn't unusual for officers to respond to calls about car troubles on that road, as the terrain and thick woods made it a common sight for accidents. The car was just east of Little Mountain Town, where, according to the Greenville News, the road runs through a rural area and is thick with woods and steep ravines. At least 2 fatal accidents had occurred on the stretch of road in the past. A steep embankment bordered the road where the car was found, and inside the car, officers found the body of a woman slumped over the car's steering wheel. She was later identified as 36-year-old Victoria Vickie Beckham, the daughter of a state senator. Law enforcement immediately believed Vickie's death was suspicious. Despite the fact that the road could be dangerous, there was minimal damage to the car, and the extent of Vickie's visible injuries didn't match what looked like a minor accident. For one thing, there were bruises on her neck. Sheriff Lee Foster told the Greenville News, quote, "It was very obvious that it was certainly not the type of accident that would have rendered someone dead." Along with the unusual scene inside the car, police found more evidence outside of the vehicle, further suggesting that they were not dealing with a typical crash site. Officers identified blood spatter and footprints outside the car, suggesting that Vickie had been in a struggle with her attacker and could have been killed there before being placed back inside her car. There were signs that the vehicle had been wiped down to get rid of evidence, like fingerprints, but blood was still found within the car's interior. It didn't appear that Vickie had been the victim of a robbery or carjacking attempt gone wrong, and there were no signs of sexual assault. However, there was little doubt that she had been murdered. I'm going to pause now for a short commercial break. Victoria Odell Lander was born on June 25, 1957 in Anderson, South Carolina, to parents Jim and Jolene. Vickie had 5 sisters and 1 brother, and the large family was very close. Jolene was a homemaker and Jim was a military man. He served in the military for nearly 40 years and had done multiple tours in Korea and Vietnam. Jim Lander ran for Senate as a Democrat and was elected to the South Carolina Senate earlier that year in 1994. Before he became a senator, Jim Lander retired as Chief of Staff of the South Carolina Army National Guard. Vickie Lander had been pretty outgoing and was considered a fun and kind person, and a wonderful friend. After graduating from Newberry High School, she attended the University of South Carolina, where she earned a degree in criminal justice. She went on to marry a man she met named Stephen Beckham. Beckham was the son of another prominent South Carolina man, Reverend William Beckham, the Episcopal Bishop of the Diocese of Upper South Carolina. The two began a family of their own soon after their union, eventually having 3 children, first a daughter named Shannon and then 2 boys, Andrew and Samuel. Public records show that the family moved around a lot. They lived in Myrtle Beach, then Irmo, Prosperity, and finally Pomeria. Things between Vickie and Stephen began to deteriorate drastically in the early 90s. By 1994, at the time of Vickie's death, the couple had separated and were working out the custody arrangement for their children. Vickie was living with her parents in Newberry, while Stephen lived in a trailer on his parents' property in nearby Pomeria. Stephen had scheduled visitations with the 3 kids, and Vickie always dropped her children off to him at the trailer. I never saw in newspapers or trial records what Stephen did for work, but Vickie worked as a control office administrator for a furniture corporation, and on the weekends she taught Sunday school at St. Luke's Episcopal Church. Vickie was well loved by her co-workers, who, like the rest of her friends and family, were shocked at the sudden news of her violent death. After identifying the victim as Vickie Beckham, police began to retrace her steps that evening and day to determine when she was last seen alive. They soon found that Vickie had last been seen when she dropped off her 3 kids at her estranged husband's home at 6 p.m. that evening. Vickie was supposed to go to work afterwards, but she never showed up. Based on these last known movements, police were not sure why Vickie would have been traveling on Little Mountain Road. It was around 12 miles from Stephen's place and was in the opposite direction of her work. When police spoke with Stephen, They told him Vickie had been found dead. One of the sheriff's deputies said that Stephen just kind of backed up and didn't really say anything in response to the news. Stephen and Vickie's children were still at their father's that night, giving the officers an opportunity to speak with them as well. Police first spoke with Stephen and Vickie's daughter, Shannon. She told officers that she and her mom had spent the afternoon sunbathing. When her mom dropped her and her siblings off at their dad's, she gave her mom a hug and told her she loved her. Shannon told investigators that there were around 15 to 20 minutes when she wasn't sure where her dad was, and she told her younger siblings that their parents had driven away together. Police also spoke with Vickie and Stephen's son, Andrew. He told police that his parents left at around 6:30 p.m. and that his mom was driving. An autopsy concluded that Vickie died from a deadly blow to the neck with a blunt object. In fact, she appeared to have been pistol whipped. During this severe beating, her larynx, vocal cords, and spine were all crushed. Vickie's injuries were so severe that Sheriff Foster said the killer could face the death penalty because the beating was brutal enough that it could qualify as torture. In the beginning of the investigation, police received and looked into hundreds of tips, sent DNA to the lab for testing, and even used an FBI computer program that makes it easier to analyze and compare information. But weeks, then months, went by without any real movement in the case. As is usual with homicide cases, investigators looked into Vickie's relationship with those closest to her, namely her estranged husband. Rumors circulated that at one point in time, Vickie had sought help for emotional abuse. Stephen Beckham was obviously already a person of interest as her soon-to-be ex-husband and the last person to see her alive. But the rumors suggested a more sinister motive. After 9 months, the police still had not made any arrests. During this time, the children continued to live with their father, and the rest of Vickie's loved ones struggled with the frustration that the ongoing investigation had seemed to run cold. Sheriff Lee Foster told the Greenville News that, quote, "Whoever was involved took great pains in trying to cover up the murder to make sure police wouldn't have anything to go on." Police said they thought Vickie was killed somewhere else and then placed in her vehicle in order to stage a deadly crash and cover up a murder. Sheriff Foster further elaborated, quote, "If the car had gone off on the other side of the road, the way the killer intended, it would have been extremely difficult to prove this was a murder instead of a traffic accident. It's a sheer drop-off with trees and heavy brush. If the car had gone over the edge, it would have met with a pretty violent impact. It would have been difficult for anyone to have even found the car. Whoever is responsible for this was cold and calculating, and we must be equally as calculating in solving the crime." Despite their lack of an arrest in the case, police did tell the media that they had at least 3 suspects, and they believed that more than one person was involved. But they didn't explain why they thought the attack involved more than just one perpetrator. A little over a year after Vickie and her car had been found in a ditch along the deserted Little Mountain Road, investigators announced that they had made an arrest in the case and had issued a warrant for another suspect. On July 10, 1995, 35-year-old Richard Anderson was arrested and charged with Vickie's murder. Police said Anderson had been a suspect earlier on in their investigation and hadn't been ruled out. Richard Anderson was described as a big, hulking man who was a bouncer from a Myrtle Beach topless club called Smugglers, where he met Stephen Beckham. Richard told police that Stephen asked him to help kill someone for $5,000. He later learned the intended target was Stephen's wife. Stephen told Richard that he was going through a divorce and was worried Vickie would find out he'd been involved in drug deals. Richard told police he and Stephen had tried to kill Vickie once before on June 8th, but the plan didn't work out. At around 6:30 p.m. on the 8th, Vickie dropped the children off at Stephen's house, but the plan was foiled when Vickie showed up with her Aunt Bonnie in the car with her. Richard had waited in his designated spot, but when Stephen arrived, he was alone. Richard said Stephen told him things weren't right, and he'd have to make some changes. Richard told investigators that on June 12th, he met Stephen at a store off Interstate 26, just outside Newberry County. They left Richard's car on Mountain Road so they would have a getaway car after they staged the accident. Stephen took Richard to a secluded area off a logging road near his house and told Richard to wait before driving away. The plan was that Stephen would kill Vickie, then bring her body to Richard. Richard would smash the window of the car and break her neck, so it looked like a fatal car accident. According to Richard, at around 6:15 p.m., Vickie dropped off the kids at Stephen's house as expected. The children went into the trailer while Stephen got into Vickie's car to talk. At some point, Stephen put on latex gloves and beat Vickie with a gun until she was unconscious. When Stephen drove up to Richard in Vickie's car, he was wiping the car's dashboard down with a towel. Richard told police that Vickie was covered with blood. She was between the seats toward the rear passenger door, and her legs were still in the front seat. Richard said he opened the rear passenger door and reached in to pull her body over. He was also wearing latex gloves. Richard told police that when he reached for Vickie's body, it sounded like she was still trying to breathe. Though she was fading in and out of consciousness and struggling to breathe, Vickie scratched Richard. This threw him off, causing him to hesitate for a second, because according to their plan, Vickie was already supposed to be dead. Stephen said there wasn't anything he could do. They had to stick to the next part of the plan: break Vickie's neck, then stage a car accident. Richard said he then reached into the car to see if Vickie had a pulse. He said he felt Stephen move behind him, and when he turned around, Stephen was standing behind him, holding a gun. Stephen asked if Vickie was dead yet, and then told Richard he knew what he had to do before he ran off into the woods. At this point, Richard was supposed to just be an accomplice to covering up Vickie's murder. But instead of leaving, he decided to finish her off. He still wanted his $5,000. He grabbed the bolt cutters he had brought with him to cut the lock on the logging road, and then he used them to forcefully hit Vickie, who at this point appeared completely lifeless, in the side of her neck. Then he picked her up and moved her body to the other side of the car. Richard said he dipped his shirt in a water puddle and wiped Vickie's face and arms before wiping down the car in an attempt to cover his tracks. Then he looked for the $5,000 that Stephen said would be in the car, but it wasn't there. At that point, according to what Richard told the police, he felt like he'd been hung out to dry, and the only thing he could do was get in his car and get out of there. He drove Vickie's car to Mountain Road, then moved her to the driver's seat. Headlights appeared, causing him to panic, and Richard thought to hell with this as he pushed the car. It only went over to the right side of the road instead of going off the cliff, but Richard didn't care. He just needed to get out of there before anyone noticed him. Maybe if Stephen Beckham had left the money as promised, Richard Anderson would have carried out the plan. Authorities may have never even found Vickie's body if Richard hadn't walked away. I'm going to pause now to hear a word from today's sponsors. Early in the morning the day after Richard's arrest, on July 11th, Stephen and his 3 children left for Florida. After being on the road for a while, Stephen checked the family into a Daytona Beach hotel using a fake name. But they were only there for an hour before Stephen told the staff they had to leave due to a family emergency. While they were on the road, police announced a warrant had been issued for the arrest of Stephen Beckham in connection with his wife's murder. Investigators told the local media that they were unsure of his and his children's whereabouts, and while they were concerned for the children, they weren't really worried about their safety. Police had last spoken with Stephen the previous month, on July 12th, the 1-year anniversary of Vickie's murder. People who knew the Beckham kids told police that the children told them they were leaving Newberry with their dad on the morning of July 11th, but they didn't know where they were going. A nationwide manhunt involving local, state, and federal agencies ensued, and the public was asked to be on the lookout for a maroon 1989 Honda. Following the media attention and bolo out for his client's car, Stephen's attorney told the media he believed his client had taken the children on a pre-planned trip and simply didn't know there was a warrant out for his arrest. Later on that day, police searched Stephen's house. They were looking for the gun Richard said Stephen used to beat Vickie. During the search, police found a gun and a pair of latex gloves in a nightstand in Stephen's bedroom. After checking out of the hotel in Florida, Stephen and the 3 kids drove all night to Kentucky. They checked into a hotel in Williamsburg, where they stayed for 2 days. It was there that, after 4 total days being a fugitive, Stephen called an acquaintance from his church, Reverend Elizabeth Libby, and asked her to help him get his children home safely. Reverend Libby was the rector of St. Francis of Assisi Episcopal Church in Chapin, close to Newberry, South Carolina. She and her husband, Reverend Robert Libby, agreed to meet Stephen and the kids in a Pizza Hut parking lot in Williamsburg, Kentucky. After arriving, the Libbys decided to drive the Beckhams to their home on Lake Murray in South Carolina. On the way, Reverend Elizabeth told Shannon, the oldest child, to call her uncle and have him bring their grandfather, Stephen's dad, Reverend William Beckham, the bishop, to meet them at their home. Despite their initial plans to make it to the Libby home, at some point during the drive, Reverend Robert tried to wake up Stephen, who had been sleeping during the trip. Stephen's eyes had rolled back into his head and he began drooling. Not knowing what was wrong, the Libbys drove until they made it to their church, and Reverend Robert called 911. In the early hours of July 15th, at around 1 a.m., an ambulance was dispatched to the church. The caller said someone had overdosed. The papers at the time didn't specify, but later in court, it would come out that Stephen had a cocaine habit. When police arrived, they found Stephen Beckham, Stephen's father, the Reverend Bishop, and another clergyman outside the church. Stephen was taken to the hospital, where after he recovered, he was kept under guard until he was officially arrested and transferred to jail on the 18th. The children were not with Stephen when he was arrested and were instead found at Stephen's parents' home in Pomeria. The kids were then taken to stay with Vickie's parents. Stephen's father told police that he'd received a call to go to the home of 2 clergy members. On the way there, he was driving by the church when he saw the ambulance and found out it was there for his son. Police eventually found Stephen's maroon 1989 Honda abandoned in rural Kentucky. Investigators didn't buy the story that Stephen had taken his children on a vacation and instead believed he had made a poor attempt at evading arrest. As they worked to build a case against him and his accomplice, Richard Anderson, detectives tried to determine if other parties were involved. After finding Stephen in the company of his father, police investigated if the bishop had any role in his son's escape, suggesting that he may have aided in his son avoiding capture for several days. As you can imagine, that went over like a fart in church, pun intended. The Reverend Bishop released a statement to Sheriff Lee Foster that said, quote, "I'll not be intimidated by you or anyone else. Either arrest me or make a statement that I am cleared." He also told the sheriff that he and his attorney would meet with police and answer questions, stating, quote, "I will do this only one time, so get your best investigator, or better yet, yourself, and let's get this over with. Since Stephen's arrest, I have silently put up with your public statements regarding me and my family. If you have not reached the level of libel, you have come very close." I love that he thinks he can tell the police that he will only be interviewed one time. In late October, while in jail, Stephen wrote 2 letters to the press. He sent them to the Columbia State newspaper. In the letters, Stephen denied ever abusing Vickie and instead insisted that he had tried to help her with her emotional problems and mental health. Stephen claimed that Vickie had been struggling with depression, panic attacks, and substance abuse. In the letter, he blamed some of Vickie's problems on her father, Senator Jim Lander. Stephen wrote that Vickie had confided in him that one of Lander's acquaintances had molested her as a child, and that when she told her dad, he, quote, dismissed it as nonsense and told her to never speak of it again. Stephen claimed that Vickie's substance abuse problems were caused by the molestation, which he said also caused him to file for divorce. He said, quote, "I have avoided saying anything negative about Vickie out of respect for her and our children, but the truth is, she had experienced problems with depression and panic attacks and had received treatment from therapists." In response to this letter and in a public statement, Vickie's father denied that she had ever told him she'd been molested. When Jim Lander was asked about the substance abuse allegations, he appeared shocked, stating, "I'm not going to respond to anything in a letter of that sort." In these letters, Stephen Beckham also claimed that Sheriff Foster was just out to get him. He mentioned that both he and his father had challenged Sheriff Foster to a lie detector test and alleged that the sheriff had tried to date Vickie before she was married. Stephen and his powerful father clearly thought they could bully the press and public opinion. But Stephen's plan backfired as the newspaper followed up with other sources. When they published these inflammatory letters, the Columbia State also reported that sources had told them Vickie did seek help for emotional abuse from Sister Care, a resource for abused women. In the weeks leading up to the trial, the prosecution announced that they would be seeking the death penalty. Because of this, Stephen could no longer afford a private attorney. So in an odd twist, his private attorneys were appointed as his public defenders, despite being two of the most expensive criminal lawyers in South Carolina and not being on the public defenders list with the court. The attorneys said they had been retained by Stephen's family, but the retainer didn't cover the cost of defending a death penalty case. It eventually came out that after Stephen was arrested, a letter was sent to church leaders asking their congregations to donate to a defense fund. They raised around $118,000 for Stephen's defense and for a custody fight over the Beckham children with the Lander family. The bishop later confirmed that some of the money was used to pay for Stephen's defense, and when the court found out about the raised funds, Stephen's attorneys were barred from seeking additional fees from the Public Defender Fund. On January 22, 1996, Richard Anderson and Stephen Beckham were both slapped with additional charges in the case, conspiracy and kidnapping. On April 10, 1996, Richard Anderson was supposed to attend an evidentiary hearing, but right before it was set to start, his defense attorney approached the prosecution about a plea deal. A deal was set between Anderson's defense team and the prosecution, and on that same day, Richard Anderson pled guilty to murder and conspiracy. It was ordered that he would not be sentenced to life in prison until he completed his end of the plea deal by testifying against Stephen at his trial. Later, on October 30th, 1996, Richard was sentenced to life without parole for 20 years for murder and 5 years for conspiracy to commit murder. I'm going to pause now to hear a final word from today's sponsors. Jury selection for Stephen Beckham's trial began in September of 1996 and went on for 3 days. The selection process posed a problem for both the prosecution, who worried that the number of Episcopalians in the community would sway the favor in Stephen's direction, and the defense, who believed that Lander's upcoming re-election campaign for the Senate would taint the jury. Because of this, jury selection was moved to nearby Oconee County, and eventually 7 women and 5 men were chosen and then sequestered in Newberry County, where the trial would still take place. During this time, the Beckham and the Lander families were in the throes of an intense custody battle. Originally, after their father's arrest, all 3 of the children were living with Vickie's parents, but by the time of his trial in late September, the 2 older children lived with Stephen's family, while the youngest lived with Vickie's. Throughout the trial, tensions between the Beckham and Lander families only grew higher. 2 highway patrol troopers stood at either end of the front row to maintain peace. At one point, Vickie's mother, Jolene, tried to speak to Stephen's parents, but she was completely ignored. The prosecution built their case around the confession of Richard Anderson and his testimony against Stephen. But they also weaved a story about a cocaine-fueled man who wanted nothing more than to murder his wife. They presented evidence showing that Stephen had asked at least 4 people to kill Vickie, dating back to 1991, 3 years before her murder. They said for at least 7 years before Vickie's murder, Stephen would often go to strip clubs and use and sell cocaine, and that was how he met Richard Anderson. According to the prosecution, Stephen hired the huge club bouncer to help kidnap and kill Vickie after planning the murder for months, including bringing Richard up from Myrtle Beach to look for places to leave Vickie's body. During the trial, they explained that after the kids were dropped off, Stephen initiated his plan to kill Vickie between 6:15 and 6:45 p.m. He pressured Vickie into letting him get in the car with her to discuss their custody arrangements, and then lured her to a secluded spot where he brutally beat her. Prosecutors described how Vickie was attacked with fists, a gun, and a bolt cutter, and referred to the autopsy that showed how her neck was broken and her esophagus was crushed. They explained that the car crash was then staged to cover up the murder. They theorized that Stephen threatened to kill the children if she didn't comply, and said that Vickie sacrificed herself for her children. As an explanation for Stephen's motive to murder his wife, the prosecution pointed to a financial incentive. Stephen knew he was the beneficiary of a $100,000 life insurance policy on his wife. They also said that 2 tax liens had been filed against Stephen and Vickie in 1989 and 1992. One for a little over $27,000 and the other for just over $37,000. They theorized that Stephen could have used the $100,000 life insurance payout to pay off both the tax liens, and then he would have had around $35,000 left over to start a new life without his wife. The prosecution pointed out that Stephen used his children after the murder when he found out there was a warrant out for his arrest. He went on the run to Kentucky, using his children as an excuse to avoid being arrested. Vickie's Aunt Bonnie testified that on June 8, 1994, she and Vickie dropped the kids off at Stephen's. While there, Stephen kept asking Vickie to drop Bonnie off and come back, claiming he had to talk to her about what they would do if he moved to Myrtle Beach. Vickie kept telling him no. Bonnie said after dropping the kids off, they went to Sister Care, a resource for spousal abuse, from 6:30 p.m. to 9:30 p.m. The defense immediately moved for a mistrial after Bonnie's testimony, on the grounds that by talking about Sister Care, she had injected the prejudicial issue of spousal abuse into the case. The judge denied the motion. Richard Anderson also testified, telling the jury that Stephen ran from the murder scene through the woods back to his place. 3 photos of Stephen were shown to the jury, and in the pictures, Stephen's back and arms had scratches on them. When it was time for Stephen's defense, they had their work cut out for them, but they decided to keep it simple. They argued that Stephen had nothing to do with Vickie's death and that the prosecution didn't have enough physical evidence to prove that he was involved. They explained that no fingerprints belonging to Stephen, or Richard for that matter, were found in the car. Instead of a murder-for-hire plot, the defense concocted a tale about Stephen buying drugs from Richard, which he claimed he regretted because he said that was what led to Vickie's death. His attorney said police were aggressive and were anxious to arrest someone, despite the year-long investigation before any arrests were made, and claimed that Richard Anderson had told police at least 6 different accounts of his involvement. They said Anderson wasn't reliable because he made a deal with prosecutors. In an effort to poke holes in the prosecution's timeline, the defense had Stephen's children, father, and aunt testify about a series of phone calls and sightings that they alleged would have made it impossible for Stephen to have been gone long enough to kill Vickie. The defense also argued that Stephen didn't know he was a beneficiary of Vickie's life insurance, claiming that though Stephen and Vickie took out life insurance policies in 1990, Stephen thought Vickie's had lapsed. They also said that the tax liens were not a motive to kill Vickie. If she was alive, he'd only be liable for 50% of the amount. With Vickie dead, he was liable for 100%. Stephen's Aunt Elsie testified for the defense that she was visiting Stephen's parents on June 12th and saw Stephen coming from the pond on the Beckham property at around 7 p.m. Stephen's father also testified. Although he never told the police this information, the Reverend Bishop now testified that he saw Stephen standing by the pond just before 6:30 p.m. on June 12th. During cross-examination, the bishop was openly hostile to the prosecutor, causing the trial judge to hold a bench conference and tell him to respond to the questions he was asked and to stop editorializing. Stephen's attorneys also spoke with the bishop without the jury present about his style and demeanor on the stand. You can just imagine trying to rein in a man like Bishop William Beckham, a man used to being an authority and saying exactly what he wanted to with his thundering voice. After the conference and talk, the prosecutor asked the bishop whether Stephen was with him during a conversation with the coroner. The bishop said, "You're saying, I really don't recall Stephen being with me. You're saying that." The judge had to stop again. He told the bishop, in front of the jury this time, that if he did not stop, he would be held in contempt. The Reverend Bishop was then able to finish without being held in contempt and apologized to the judge. Stephen and Vickie's 17-year-old daughter Shannon testified for the defense. She refused to say anything negative about her dad and said she told her dad to run when she found out he was going to be charged with the murder. Shannon said she was upset and didn't understand how police could arrest her dad. She said she also told her dad not to come home and told him he should go to Canada instead. Shannon testified that when her dad came back after leaving her mom on June 12th, he wasn't sweating or bloody. The entirety of Shannon's testimony was emotional for most of the courtroom. At one point, Stephen's defense attorney asked Shannon, quote, "Who is the man in this courtroom who is trying to put your dad in the electric chair?" To which the prosecution immediately objected and the judge ordered the jury out of the room. In response, the judge said that he had been lenient long enough and told everyone to control themselves or they would face being sent to jail. Stephen and Vickie's 14-year-old son Andrew also testified for the defense. Like his older sister, he refused to say anything that would hurt his father. When the prosecutor asked Andrew about a discussion with an investigator concerning the last minutes of his mom's life, Andrew replied, "How do we know that was the last minutes of my mom's life?" When the prosecutor asked about Stephen's activities on June 12th, Andrew looked at his dad, smiled, and shook his head at the prosecutor. He claimed he wasn't sure what he'd told investigators back on that day. The trial concluded with heavy and emotional closing arguments from both the prosecution and the defense. The prosecution addressed the jury, arguing that Stephen Beckham had used his children to lure Vickie into riding with him that night. Quote, "He used those children. He used them then and he used them here. They are trying to help him get away with murder. They are being used by him as a shield from you and from the truth." The prosecution also had a pathologist testify who said that Vickie Beckham had likely suffered 4 to 15 minutes from the brutal beating before Anderson finally broke her neck. The defense argued again that the police had rushed to assign blame to Stephen despite what they claimed was little evidence in the case. They said the investigators in the case had not conducted a proper investigation and instead were basing their investigation off the word of an unreliable source, Richard Anderson. After all the heated exchanges, emotional testimony, and dramatic closings, the jury deliberated for 7 hours, and on September 2nd, 1996, Stephen Beckham was found guilty of murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy to commit murder. As Stephen was taken from the courtroom, his daughter cried, "Don't take my daddy," over and over as she slipped into her grandfather's arms, and her younger brother Andrew stormed out of the courtroom. Shannon and Andrew then went to see their maternal grandfather the night before the penalty phase, asking for his help to save their father from the death penalty. Senator Jim Lander said he tried to find some solution for the sake of the grandchildren, but that it was not to be. The Columbus State newspaper said he declined to elaborate on that statement. Jolene Lander, their grandmother, did tell the paper, quote, "He explained that he did not have the power to do things they seemed to perceive that he did." The chief prosecutor in the case, Towns Jones, later said that he never had second thoughts about seeking the death penalty. He also pointed out that the Reverend Bishop William Beckham was the man who baptized him. He explained that he never saw any remorse from Stephen Beckham. While Senator Lander wouldn't technically have any say-so on the death penalty in his daughter's case, you can see how he might have had some influence on the prosecution. But I don't believe he ever tried to. The Lander family really tried to play fair during this whole tragedy, while the Beckhams continuously manipulated the press and had outbursts in court. During the penalty phase, the prosecution argued that there were 3 aggravating circumstances for the death penalty: a hired killing, kidnapping, and torture. The defense argued that Stephen's co-conspirator Richard wasn't going to get the death penalty, despite admitting to being the one who delivered the final blow to Vickie's neck. Stephen addressed the jury in a 2-minute statement asking for mercy on behalf of his children. He said, while tears welled in his eyes, quote, "I just want you to see I'm Stephen Beckham. I'm human. I recognize in my life I've made some huge mistakes. I've caused a lot of other people a lot of pain, I guess. For that, I apologize. Life in prison doesn't appeal to me. Dying might be easier for me, but not for my children. I just don't want my children to hurt anymore." The strongest witness for his sentencing was again his daughter Shannon, who cried and said, "I'm Daddy's little girl. He loves us more than anything. He's all I've got left." Beckham's lead defense attorney implored the jury members, quote, "It's so easy to ask for death, but life is precious. And these children, they need Stephen Beckham alive. And it seems the jury agreed. On October 5th, after deliberating for less than 2 hours, they decided Stephen should receive life in prison instead of the death penalty. Stephen was sentenced to life without parole for 30 years for murder, 30 years for kidnapping, and 5 years for conspiracy to commit murder. All sentences were to run concurrently. Both families were reportedly happy about the life sentence, and the judge urged the families to come together. Vickie's mother told the press, quote, "As we heal together, our hope is that the children will return to the same loving feelings they had for the entire Lander family prior to their mother's death." Stephen's brother Bill Beckham immediately stood up after the sentencing and went and hugged Vickie's father. Following the conviction, Stephen continued to write letters to newspapers saying he was innocent and that police didn't investigate Richard's accomplice. He appealed to the Supreme Court of South Carolina, saying that the judge erred when he denied the motion for a mistrial based on Bonnie's comment about sister care. Stephen also said that 3 photos of him with scratches on his back and arms should not have been admitted, and that the judge should not have allowed evidence of the life insurance policy and the tax liens into trial because it was prejudicial, and also that the judge erred by not allowing him to admit evidence of third-party guilt. He wanted to introduce evidence that there were 2 men seen on Little Mountain Road on the night of Vickie's murder. In February of 1999, the court affirmed Stephen Beckham's convictions. The court said that Bonnie's reference to sister care did not necessarily imply that Vickie was a battered spouse. The jury could have thought that Vickie was there as a volunteer or was visiting a worker or friend. The court said that the photos of the scratches, the life insurance policy, and the tax liens were all relevant to the trial and were therefore admissible. They did rule that the judge should have allowed Stephen to introduce evidence about the 2 men, but argued that the ruling was harmless. The state's evidence against Stephen was still strong. Vickie's mother, Jolene, met with Richard Anderson after his sentencing and gave him a Bible. She told the Greenville News, quote, "I want him to know I believe him, and I know he was being honest. Nothing can ever make what he did all right, but I think he realizes that. I believe he was terribly intimidated by Stephen." The now 61-year-old Richard Anderson is currently incarcerated in Lieber Correctional Institution in Ridgeville, South Carolina. His projected parole eligibility is January 8, 2022. He was already denied parole once in 2015. On November 1, 2005, Stephen Beckham made headlines again for a role he played in the escape plan of 2 other inmates. The 2 escapees hid in a dumpster truck that was being driven out of the correctional facility. Beckham helped make dummies out of clothes and toilet paper to fool correction officials during head counts, helping the convicts get a head start. Following the inmates' eventual captures, Stephen was indicted by a Richland County grand jury for his part in the escape plot. 61-year-old Stephen Beckham is currently incarcerated in Tiger River Correctional Institution in Honore, South Carolina. His projected parole eligibility is July 18, 2025. I guess because of my age, it seems shocking he could be out in a few years. This case happened while I was in college, and naturally, it doesn't feel like enough time has passed. Considering the tensions between the 2 families, I wonder if Vickie's family will show up for his parole hearings. Her father, Senator Jim Lander, has passed away, as well as her closest sister, Terry, who died at only age 49. The Landers were always kind and tried to maintain dignity throughout the trial. I noticed when Stephen's mother, Harriet Beckham, passed away in 2013, Senator Lander wrote on her memorial page, quote, "Jolene and I are saddened by Harriet's passing. We shall remember her as a gracious lady, even as she experienced some sad and horrific times." I certainly hope the 2 families were able to find some peace. And I hope the Beckham children made peace with their mother's family. I am curious how the passage of time has affected their feelings about their father. Maybe we will see in a few years at Stephen Beckham's parole hearings. Despite the fact that the prosecution did seek the death penalty, one newspaper said they didn't put on the strongest case at sentencing. The Columbia State wrote that a deputy prosecutor told them that they wanted to keep the focus on the brutality of the case, so they had the pathologist testify. But unlike with the Beckhams, They only put Jolene Lander on the stand for the emotional impact testimony. I have a feeling at that point they knew it wasn't worth it. That deputy prosecutor had also revealed that the state did not want to grill grieving relatives during the trial. It's one thing to charge the death penalty. It's quite another to watch the destructive effect it has on the defendant's children as they testify. I think justice was served, and I ache for Vickie's children. I cannot imagine being in a situation like that. But my heart still hurts for Vickie Lander Beckham. The 36-year-old mother seemed lost in all the emotional testimony designed to save her murderer. The last moments of her life were dark, brutal, and lonely. She deserved so much better. Why couldn't the son of a bitch just divorce her? He hurt so many people with his coldness and greed. Divorce is war. It's messy and traumatic. But death is forever. You can't take it back. I hope the parole board remembers this when Stephen Beckham's number is called. Southern Fried True Crime is produced by me, Erica Kelley. Today's episode was researched by Haley Gray, written by Hannah Newcomb, with additional research and writing by me. The audio is edited and mixed by Ches Gray of Gray Multimedia. Southern Fried's original music is by Rob Harrison of Gamma Radio, and the original graphic art is by Coley Horner. Thank you to Kelly Roberts for suggesting today's case. And apologies for my super scratchy voice on this episode. Allergies suck. As some of you already know, Facebook shut down our lovely group. It happened overnight without warning or explanation, and it happened to many groups. But we have already started a new one. Search for Southern Fried True Crime Fans Discussion Group. We will still be worshiping our patron saint, Dolly Parton, sharing recipes, and in general, being supportive and good to each other. I still intend for it to be a safe and fun corner of Facebook, so the rule is still no shit asses allowed. If you enjoyed today's show, don't forget to subscribe and please tell a friend or rate and review on iTunes. I'm also on most large platforms like Stitcher and Spotify, as well as Stitcher Premium, where you can listen ad-free. If you have any case suggestions, please email southernfriedtruecrime@gmail.com. I do not accept case suggestions on social media private messaging. But please feel free to reach out by email. Not only do I get my most interesting and little-known cases from listener suggestions, I love hearing from you guys. Until next time, thanks so much for listening. Y'all take care.